The psychology of people who never get tattoos. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Your friend just got their third tattoo. Your coworker is planning a full sleeve. Your social media feed looks like a never-ending gallery of fresh ink. And then there's you. Completely blank skin. No symbols, no quotes, no permanent reminders. And somehow, you're the one people find strange. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Choosing to stay tattoo-free is not simple. It's not boring. And it's definitely not accidental. In fact, psychologically speaking, it's often more complex than getting tattooed. Let's start with the numbers. Today, nearly half of millennials have at least one tattoo. Tattoos are no longer rebellious. They're mainstream, normalized, even expected in some circles. Which raises an interesting question. If tattoos are so common, why do some people consciously opt out? And what does that choice reveal about how they think, feel, and relate to themselves over time? 1. Permanence isn't the real reason. Time is most people assume the reason is obvious. It's permanent. But that explanation doesn't really hold up. We live in a world where people sign 30-year mortgages, commit to lifelong marriages, have children, move countries, and change careers without blinking. Those are far more permanent than a small symbol on skin. So why does a tattoo feel different? The answer lies in a psychological concept called future self-continuity. Some people experience a strong connection to their future selves. They can imagine who they'll be in 10, 20, or 30 years, and they feel emotionally aligned with that person. Others don't. For them, their future self feels almost like a stranger. And when you feel disconnected from who you'll become, making permanent decisions for that future version of you feels deeply uncomfortable. Getting a tattoo, in that case, doesn't feel like self-expression. It feels like making a decision on behalf of someone you don't fully know yet. And that hesitation is not immaturity. It's temporal awareness. Research consistently shows that personality traits, values, and identity priorities can shift significantly across decades. The things that feel defining at 19 don't always feel relevant at 45. People who avoid tattoos are often unusually skilled at mentally simulating future regret before it happens. Psychologists call this low temporal discounting, the ability to take future consequences seriously, rather than prioritizing present emotion. This isn't indecision, it's long-range thinking. 2. The psychology of a fluid identity. Now let's go deeper. Some people don't avoid tattoos because they lack identity. They avoid tattoos because their identity is deliberately fluid. These individuals don't see themselves as a finished product. They see themselves as an evolving process. Their values shift. Their interests deepen. Their worldview expands. And because of that, they resist permanent declarations of who they are right now. A tattoo, by nature, is a statement. This matters to me enough to define me. But what if your philosophy is not wanting to be defined by any single chapter of your life? Psychologically, this connects to something known as identity exploration versus identity foreclosure. Identity foreclosure happens when someone commits too early to a fixed self-concept without allowing room for exploration. People who remain tattoo-free often have a strong sensitivity to this. They worry, consciously or unconsciously, that permanent symbols could lock them into a past version of themselves. However, and this matters, this trait exists on a spectrum. At its healthiest, it reflects openness, adaptability, and growth. At its unhealthiest, it can mask avoidance, fear of self-definition, fear of commitment, or discomfort with being seen clearly. The line between staying open and staying unformed can be thin, and many people walk it carefully. 3. Social awareness, control, and impression management. Despite how normalized tattoos have become, they are still socially loaded. They still communicate something, whether we want them to or not, professionally, culturally, familially. People who choose not to get tattoos often engage in higher levels of impression management, a psychological term for being aware of how one is perceived and strategically shaping that perception. To them, tattoos represent a loss of control. Once the symbol exists, it speaks, even when you don't want it to. And some people are simply more sensitive to that. They calculate, how will this affect my career? How will I be interpreted? What assumptions will people make about me? This isn't always anxiety. Sometimes it's strategic intelligence, but sometimes it is anxiety. And the psychology shifts depending on whether the avoidance comes from self-trust or fear of judgment. Same behavior, completely different inner motive. 4. The minimalist philosophy of unmarked skin. Here's a perspective almost nobody mentions. For some people, unmarked skin is not the absence of expression. It is the expression, a form of psychological minimalism. These individuals believe their identity doesn't require external symbols to be real or meaningful. They operate from what psychologists call an intrinsic identity orientation, the sense that who you are exists internally, independent of visual markers. They don't need reminders etched into their body. They don't forget what matters to them. Their values live in memory, behavior, and relationships, not ink. In a culture obsessed with visible meaning, this quiet internalization becomes a form of rebellion. Not loud, not performative, but deliberate. 5. Memory without markers. There's a common assumption that tattoos preserve meaning, but psychology tells a more nuanced story. Some people encode meaningful experiences internally, not symbolically. They process moments deeply in the present, rather than externalizing them into objects or imagery. And interestingly, research on memory suggests that internally processed meaning can be just as vivid, sometimes more so, than externally reinforced memory. You don't forget your childhood home because it isn't tattooed on your body. You don't forget people who mattered because you didn't brand their names into your skin. Meaning doesn't require a medium. For some minds, permanence lives internally. The real takeaway. Here's the truth most conversations miss. The psychology of people who never get tattoos is not less deep than the psychology of people who do. It's just different. It involves future-oriented thinking, identity, flexibility, social awareness, internalized meaning, and sometimes honest self-restraint. And sometimes, yes, it involves fear. Just as tattoos can sometimes be about expression, they can also be about impulsivity. Just as avoidance can reflect wisdom, it can also reflect hesitation. Neither path is superior. What matters is conscious choice. Because the real psychological divide isn't between tattooed and tattoo-free. It's between people who live deliberately and people who move unconsciously through their decisions. Ink or no ink. Both are just answers to the same question. Who am I? And how do I want to show up in the world?